Welcome to the Lunch and Learn webinar series. My name's Sue Reid. I do client relations for On-Site Health Solutions. This Lunch and Learn series is going to be presented by Professor Drew Dawson, who is a global expert on fatigue.
So what I'd like to start off and try and get you to understand is that if we look at working time arrangements around Australia over the last 20 years, then the vast majority of enterprise bargaining agreements and working time arrangements have involved increases in working time arrangements. And for most organisations, the idea of going back to the 8-hour day is probably never actually going to happen. So the challenge is, how do we actually manage fatigue in the context of an industrial landscape in which working time arrangements are getting longer? And most importantly, how do we manage working time arrangements in a situation where prescription of working time arrangements can be quite paradoxical? And a really good example of that is work we did from a rail industry partner a couple of years ago. And what we found was when we asked those rail industry partners what they were doing about fatigue, they were very committed to the idea of managing fatigue. And they pointed out to us that they would be more than happy to stop a train 30 or 40 minutes out of a depot, put that crew in a car and drive them back to this depot, and put a new crew into the train and pay them a full shift, even though they may only have to drive 40 or 50 minutes because they didn't want a tired individual driving the train. And they saw that as an index of their commitment, and at the time we said, so what happened to the people who were in the train who were too tired? And they said, oh, well, they got in the car and drove back to the depot. And as is not hard to work out, it's actually far more risky to be driving a car tired than it is to be driving a train, because the amount of controls in place in the train and the number of degrees of freedom in the motion of the train are actually much safer than it is driving a car. And again, we see those kind of paradoxical interventions where, in order to comply with the enterprise bargaining agreement or some prescription of working time arrangements, we don't actually reduce fatigue-related risk, we can actually increase it. The second challenge is that 25 or 30 years ago, there were only probably a dozen rosters that were worked around Australia, and at last count, there's over 5,000. So the idea that we will have a single solution that will be suitable for all groups is probably naive. And any of you who have seen the recent Code of Practice come out of SafeWork, the draft Code of Practice, which we'll talk about a little later, you realise that that draft Code of Practice is not well suited to the diversity of working time arrangements. If you look at what's happening in mining, resources, emergency services, medical, healthcare, and those kinds of operations, you'll know that the idea that you could have a one-size-fits-all set of hours of work rules is not likely to happen in this day and age. So the challenge is, how do we, in a climate where working time and working hours are increasing, the different numbers of shifts have increased exponentially in the last 20 years, and where a focus on compliance rather than safety produces paradoxical outcomes, how do you actually manage fatigue in that kind of setting? You'll see when we come to the next slide. What I thought I'd do is start off with a brief understanding, and a lot of this will be well known to people, but just talk about the broad areas where we know that fatigue affects individuals. This is based on some work that was done by a graduate student of ours, Renee Petrilli, a couple of years ago, where we took a lot of the laboratory-based research that had been done on fatigue, and rather than expressing the effects of fatigue in terms of how it influenced button-pushing tests, what we decided to do was to try and understand fatigue from a naturalistic approach. This is work based on the work of Jerry Klein, who said it's probably more appropriate to think about how people decide what to do in a particular job if you think about it from the perspective of how they're actually doing the job, rather than how psychologists think about the way that people do the job. And he identified 5 key dimensions of tasks. And what we did was to construct the research literature to show how each of these 5 dimensions can be influenced by the effects of fatigue. If you look at the first of these, you'll see that on the slide it suggests that one of the effects of fatigue is to influence situational awareness. Situational awareness is a complex idea, but in very simple terms, if you're driving a car It represents, for example, the three-dimensional space around you, where you are on the road, what your speed on the road is, where you're about to drive, what lane you need to be in. If you're playing a game of chess, for example, it may be the position of all of the pieces on the board and where the game is moving. If you're a medico, it might be a set of diagnostic symptoms that a patient presents with, or a complex set of conditions that a number of patients are dealing with. But most of us understand, at least intuitively, the idea is you have to be aware of the situation within which your task is occurring in order to do that task well. Sometimes from the human factors literature perspective we talk about the decision space within which people exist. Now, sometimes that can be quite three-dimensional, for example, flying a plane or driving a car. Sometimes it can be quite abstract in terms of a managerial decision or, for example, a healthcare worker. But what we know from 40 years of research is that as you become increasingly tired, you experience a process of attentional tunnel. And what that means is that you become less aware of factors that your brain thinks are peripheral to the situation. And part of the challenge here is that what our brain has evolved over 100,000 years to consider important in a task isn't necessarily what is. So for example, if we put a tired person in a driving simulator, have them driving along a well-simulated piece of road, and then we stop the simulation and say to that individual, what was the car that you overtook 5 kilometres ago? Or what was the brand of the petrol station that you just passed? Most people would go, I have no recollection of that. Because one of the things you do as you become increasingly tired is to load shed in the same way that power stations do. That is, you push stuff off to the side and you tend not to focus on that information. That process of attentional tunnelling is quite important because it means that you can miss stuff. And the tendency for humans is to focus, when they are tired, on colour and movement in central attention and to miss things that are going on the outside. Now that can be quite important. The second area where fatigue affects us is in terms of memory. And if you think about it, situational awareness is about a separate frame in an ongoing video, and that what humans do is take that information and transfer it across to short-term memory where it's held in storage before it goes to long-term memory. What we've noticed from the research is that as situational awareness declines, that is, the information on the image at each point in time declines because of our attentional tunnelling, so does the rate at which we store that information on the memory chip in our brain, so to speak. To give you an example of how that works, it's a bit like the way a fluoro tube goes. That is, attention tends to drop out and flicker rather than slowly get duller over time. That principle of inattention or lapse, sometimes referred to as a lapse hypothesis, is a process whereby information in our current awareness doesn't transfer, and that's why many people have the experience of operating fatigue and going, oh, I've forgotten where I am in the task, or why did I come here to do that? The third area where we know that fatigue influences individuals is in what we would call simulation ability. Humans have a unique capacity to engage in what we call what if. That is, if I do this, this is what is likely to happen, in which case I will do that. The most simple example of that is playing a game of chess. If I make this move, my opponent will make this move, in which case I will do that, and you play out a scenario in your mind. And if that scenario is in the desired direction of the task, then you will typically pick what you think is the optimum strategy. What we notice when people become tired is that process of imagining out all of the possible scenarios and that exploration of the decision space stops, and people don't do it as well. And people tend to engage in what we call frequency gambling. That is what usually happens in this situation. Because you are fatigued and you lack the energy and effort to do things, then you don't think out all of the problem, and you tend to focus on things that make it easier to come to an answer, irrespective of whether that answer is correct or not. The fourth area where we see influence of fatigue is around the issue of what we've identified here as performance insight. That is, how well am I doing the task, and that process of monitoring one's performance. And if you think about driving a car when you're fatigued, there's two classic things that happen to an individual. The first is that you tend to vary your speed, both faster and slower. And similarly, position on the road, you tend to wander from left to right more. And that's always challenged people. Why is this the case? And the current thinking suggests that what happens is that in most tasks that one's involved with, there is a continuous monitoring of performance, and there's this kind of do-check loop. How am I meant to be doing? How am I actually doing? Is there a discrepancy? So am I going too fast? Slow down. Am I going too slow? Speed up. But because we tend to check how well we're doing, because we tend to reduce those kind of activities because we're attentionally tunneling on what's immediately in front of us, people can actually spend a lot of time doing a task without checking how well they're doing the task. So you may be driving down the road and you're going down a hill and speeding up, but you don't look at your speedo because that's part of the activity that you don't engage in. And as a consequence of that, you can speed up, or conversely, if you're going up a long, slow hill, you can slow down. In most tasks, people's capacity to self-monitor performance and identify when task performance is inappropriate fails. And as a result, what you're meant to be doing and what you're actually doing can get out of sync. And as a consequence, task performance is degraded. The fifth area where we see a significant effect is around what we would call emotional control. And that is, as people become increasingly fatigued, in polite terms, the authority gradients, that is how you deal with people in a group, changes. And the best way to think about that is to imagine if you were coming home from night shift, you'd just gone to bed, you'd been in bed for an hour or so, and your 5-year-old child comes in and says, "Mummy or Daddy, why is the sky blue?" And if you're really tired, your answer to that question will be probably something along the lines of, "Because it is," or "Go and ask your mother," or "That's just the way things are." That is, you tend to impose your power differential and your authority on people. So as a consequence of that, as people become tired, they tend to be less receptive to bad news from people down the power or the authority gradient within the organisation. And you've only got to reflect on the fact of how you yourself would deal. If your boss is tired and grumpy, the last thing you want to do is go and tell them bad news. This has profound implications for the ways that teams work, both in terms of the emotional control of the situation and the increasing authority gradients that it produces, but also looping back to those principles of situational awareness. We know, for example, in teams where the boss becomes tired and people are less likely to provide them information, therefore that results in their situational awareness declining and the whole thing falls into a vicious. Okay, it's important to understand that the legal context in which fatigue is being, oops, can we go back again? The legal context in which fatigue has been managed has changed quite significantly in the last 10 or 15 years in Australia. Can we go back, please, Sue? Okay. If you want to look at the history of that, we've seen a very interesting set of principles emerge around fatigue from the original decision back in the Jimenez case in the High Court of Australia back in 1990, in which a truck driver successfully argued that because he had fallen asleep at the time of the accident, he was no longer responsible for his actions, which at the time people said that doesn't really seem that sensible. But after that decision, we saw from 1993 or 4 onwards a significant shift in the way the courts thought about the law with respect to fatigue. And we saw a shift away from that traditional automaton defence, that is, because I am impaired, I'm not responsible to my actions. That is a diminished capacity argument, to one in which the courts, particularly in occupational health and safety settings, see it as a state of voluntary impairment. The only question is, who is responsible for volunteering that degree of impairment? And that's where we've seen the chain of responsibility legislation come out since around about 2003 or 4, in which they have made the decision that not only is the fatigued individual responsible for operating while fatigued, but to the extent that the employer or other individuals have contributed to that fatigue, so they should share liability for it. So what that means is, as an organisation, if you require somebody to provide work for you, or you provide work to a contractor, if they require you to work in ways that results in you being fatigued and there is an accident, then they potentially are responsible. What we've seen happen over the last couple of years is a principle emerge in the courts around how courts think about your liability with respect to fatigue. And what has emerged is what's been referred to as the principle of reasonable foreseeability. If you think that you are not responsible for somebody having a fatigue-related accident, then you would be very wrong. There are a number of people serving jail terms at the moment, and particularly even managers serving suspended jail sentences, because it was successfully argued that it was reasonably foreseeable that that decision would lead to an individual being fatigued and that that would put themselves and others at risk. The second legal principle that's emerged in the last couple of years is the principle that liability cannot be outsourced. That is, you can't create a subcontract relationship and feel that you're no longer responsible for whether somebody is operating fatigued. For those who are based in Australia, the new harmonised OH&S laws make that particularly important issue to think about over the next couple of years, because the responsibility for line managers, directors and senior managers has been significantly tightened. Could I have the next slide, please? Okay, if we want to look at the political context and how fatigue has been regulated around the country, we've seen a couple of changes in the last few years. There's probably little doubt that work intensification due to longer working hours associated with enterprise bargaining agreements has happened, and we've seen very significant increases in commute times, particularly, for example, in fly-in, fly-out or drive-in, drive-out operations. And I think a general consensus that the deregulated industrial relations workplace, while it may have produced significant productivity gains, at least in the period of 85 to 2005, has also meant that the traditional industrial mechanisms for managing fatigue aren't as successful as they used to be. As a consequence, we've started to see a shift away from industrial mechanisms for managing fatigue to one in which OH&S legislation has assumed primary responsibility for that. And as we'll talk about a little bit later, fatigue has been clearly identified as a safety hazard rather than an industrial issue, and the general principles are at the moment is that we should be managing this through a risk and safety management framework. If you look at the political context on how this has occurred, then there's been a couple of very significant parliamentary inquiries. The first one was related to the Midnight Oil Report in 2000, Fatigue in Transportation, and we'll talk a lot about that over the next little while. The second is that there is currently a committee on fly-in, fly-out, drive-in, drive-out operations, and there has been very significant concern about not only the impacts on communities of drive-in, drive-out, but the very simple fact that the number of fatalities that can be attributed to the long commutes associated with many people working in the mining sector have been significantly increased, and this has led to some significant concerns. Sue, could I have the next slide, please? Okay, if we look at OH&S regulation in Australia, you'll see a couple of key things that I think you need to be aware of in terms of managing fatigue. And the first is that Safe Work have issued a draft code of practice nationally, which came out in September with commentary through till December last year. A number of people were quite concerned about that code of practice, not least of which is it would have shut down most of defence, all of emergency services and nearly all healthcare in Australia, because it introduced a very simple and prescriptive model that basically said you can't work more than 12 hours. That code of practice, thankfully, has been withdrawn, and that code of practice is now currently being rewritten. I was quite pleased to be invited by Safe Work Australia to actually head up the rewrite of that code from an academic perspective, and that code is being reworked at the moment. And for those of you who are interested, what will form the basis, I suspect, of the next code of practice is going to be slightly different to the traditional regulation of working hours approach. I think what we're going to see is fatigue will be identified as a specific workplace hazard and a requirement that it be managed, but at the organisational level. That is, you must have a plan for how you manage fatigue, but we accept the fact that it's going to be very difficult to have a one-size-fits-all set of rules that will cover you. Consistent with the initiatives developed in the Robins legislation in the UK back in the 70s and which have flowed through general principles of OH&S hazard management in Australia since the mid-80s, there has been, I think, a reasonable argument put forward that it is reasonable for the details of a fatigue management plan to be determined at the firm level rather than by national prescription. And we have advocated 3 key principles that a fatigue management policy at the organisational level should be based upon. The first is quite a controversial, but I think very important one, and that is that the responsibilities for fatigue management should operate on a shared responsibility framework. In the past, the vast majority of fatigue management has been focused around rules of rostering, despite the fact that we know from the research that over half the time that somebody is fatigued in the workplace, it is due to non-work related factors. And that the single biggest difference that we can make to fatigue management would be to move away from a sole reliance on prescribing working hours to one in which we identify dual duty of care responsibilities for fatigue. We'll talk about that a little bit more in detail, but as a general principle is that the employer is responsible for providing people with an adequate opportunity to rest and recover. Conversely, the employee also has responsibilities to use that time away from work wisely, and where that's not been possible, to make sure that people understand that issue. The second key point around how a fatigue management policy should be developed is that it should be based around the principles of risk and safety management. And going back to the submissions that were made in the original 2000 inquiry, which the government picked up on at the time, which was to say is we have very clear Australian standards for risk and safety management, and we don't need a separate set of rules and regulations for fatigue. In effect, fatigue is just another hazard, and manage it within the confines of your current risk and safety management systems. Okay, what I thought I would do is now go on and talk about, if you are to develop a fatigue management plan, what are the key elements of that fatigue risk management system? And I'll point out here that the key elements for it are that there should be an FRMS policy document. That is, how are you going to manage fatigue at the local level? I think the second element of a fatigue risk management system is it should be competency-based, and most importantly, it should focus on training and educating people, not just about how to get a good night's sleep and to make sure the blinds are pulled down, but what are your roles and responsibilities? How do you manage an event when somebody is fatigued in the workplace and there isn't an option of taking them out? How do you manage the commute of individuals who have to work a night shift and then drive home an extremely long way? So it's really quite important that we start to think about this issue in terms of how do we manage the policy for our employees in our workplace? How do we train them to understand and identify the issue? And the third point in the FRMS is that you need to have some compliance system in place that enables you to demonstrate that in all likelihood your employees are fit for duty. And I think the 2 key elements that an organisation needs for that is that they have to have a credible risk assessment system, and we'll go on to talk about some of those in a little while. And you also need to have a credible risk control toolkit. That is, whatever it is you're doing to manage that risk needs to actually have some evidence to support the fact that it works. So a mining company who recently decided that their fatigue hazard management policy would be to provide fly-in, fly-out workers on the plane with eye covers that would enable them to sleep better on the plane, probably should think twice about that kind of policy, because there's no evidence that that actually results in more or better recovery sleep for individuals who are commuting. The last point that you need to have is some process for ensuring that the audits audit and compliance systems that identify whether what you do and what you say you're going to do are actually what's happening in practice. And in many organisations where we look at the fatigue management policies, they are full of very idealistic and sensible strategies, but when we actually go and drill down at the shop floor level, some of them are honoured in the breach, to put it politely. So it's actually quite important that each of those 4 elements are there, and if you don't have each of those 4 elements, then I think that there is some risk that your fatigue management policy won't stand up to scrutiny in terms... Okay, if we take the first of these, you need a legally defensible framework for justifying why you enable people to work the hours they work, and we need to do that in a way that justifies the large or the extreme diversity of operating circumstances. What's appropriate for a Coca-Cola or a soft drink manufacturer may be different to what's suitable for an emergency services operator who's rescuing people's lives in a bushfire, or a doctor who's saving somebody's life, or an ambulance officer. We would suggest that the most appropriate legal basis on which to develop a fatigue risk management plan would be to have this principle embedded within your fatigue management policy. That is, where the risk of working fatigued is less than the risk associated with not working, then it is reasonable for an individual to work. And the best way of explaining this is the principle we talk about, which we did with Queensland Health a number of years ago, which is to say sometimes a tired doctor is better than no doctor at all. That is, when we ask the community, would you rather a tired doctor or no access to healthcare, most people would say I would rather have no doctor at all. Now this is quite controversial in the sense that if you think about it, it's very difficult in certain industries to have enough people to do it without people inevitably being fatigued. Emergency services, healthcare, sometimes defence forces, there's a whole bunch of industries where that's unavoidable, yet people are required to work and do. But in terms of reaching that point of saying it was worth that individual working fatigue because the risks of them not working were greater, can be seen in a number of industries. For example, if your job is to restore the power to a hospital where people will die if that power is not put forward, most people in the community will go, yeah, it's okay to let that person work more than the nominal 12 hours. It may be the case that emergency services and somebody fighting a bushfire may be able to do that. But it's important that where you do try to justify it on that basis, you need to have a defensible risk assessment process, credible risk controls, and a transparent audit and review process. And most importantly, you should have anticipated the situations that are likely to emerge in your kind of workforce or workplace, and make sure that you have anticipated and developed a strategy that says, for example, an exceptional circumstances clause that says where, in the view of the management team, this is the case, that the risk of not doing the job was greater than the risk of not doing it, we will permit that. But there also has to be a process of going back, and you don't do what a certain ambulance organisation did many years ago, which was to declare everything a priority 1 alert, which justified it. You have to go back and say, are we actually being sensible and reasonable here? Could I take the next slide, sir? Okay, if we take that a little bit further and talk about the key principles that should underpin a fatigue management policy in terms of responsibilities. The previous slide talks about the legal framework for justifying the hours that people work. This talks about where responsibility and accountability lies, and you'll see that there's 3 key elements to a policy. The first point I'd make is that it's a shared responsibility for fatigue, and management in this situation is responsible for ensuring that the working time arrangements provide a sleep opportunity sufficient for employees to be fit for work for the next shift. Now, you will notice that this doesn't limit working time arrangements, and it doesn't specify what those hours should be, because the research is not sufficiently definitive to enable us to do that for all individuals in all circumstances, and organisations have to go through a process locally for trying to work out in their situation, for the tasks and the risk profile of that work group, what are reasonable guidelines. The second responsibility here is that employees are responsible for using their sleep opportunity to obtain sufficient sleep in order to be fit for work. And here's where it becomes important. Employees have a statutory obligation to notify a line manager if this is not the case. And this is a much more controversial area, but this is also the hot new area of fatigue management, which is to say we know that half the time somebody is fatigued at work, it's due to non-work related factors, and it doesn't matter what we do about rules of rostering, we're never going to identify those individuals. The best legal advice we have says it is absolutely clear that individuals have a statutory obligation under OH&S law to identify hazards in the workplace. If that individual themselves is the hazard due to fatigue, they still have an obligation to identify it. But in the event that an individual does identify that, management's responsible for providing line managers and staff with very clear guidelines on how to manage an employee who is not fit for work. And that must happen within a just culture framework. I'm going to give you a very simple hazard control model, and this is based on work by myself and Kirsty McCulloch, and we're happy to provide references by email if people are interested. But it's a multi-layered approach based on the work of Jim Reason, which says that in terms of managing fatigue within organisations, we need to take two broad approaches. And the first is that it needs to be a multi-layered approach, and that the way we've structured this is there are 5 key functions that you need to look in your organisation. The first is to identify, am I providing people with an adequate sleep opportunity? And to ensure that you have risk assessment tools that focus around assessing that in some kind of quantitative way. The second is that you need to look at the systems in your organisation that have been identified for ensuring whether people have actually obtained sufficient sleep. And we'll talk about that more a little bit later, but they're around what are called minimum sleep-wake contracts. In the same way as we say to people for drugs and alcohol, do not come to work if your blood alcohol concentration is over a certain level. Organisations are now starting to introduce what we would call prior sleep-wake rules that say if you have had less than a certain amount of sleep or you've been awake for more than a certain amount of time, you will be deemed to be at risk of a fatigue-related error. And organisations are starting to create sleep and minima and wake maxima that trigger the identification of somebody who's at risk and require some kind of controls to be put in place. And that goes back to that previous question. The third level controls are around identifying signs and symptoms of fatigue, training staff to identify in themselves and others when people are behaving in ways that are indicative of them being impaired by fatigue. And there are also a number of emerging technologies in that space at the moment. Those technologies are what sometimes referred to as the fatigue gadgets. The fourth level, and that's a more interesting level, and that's beyond the scope of today, but using the threat and error management work that came out of Helmreich's group at the University of Texas, which is to say there are a lot of people who have a lot of experience of working fatigue. And rather than go out and work out what people do wrong when they're fatigued, let's go and look at what people do right. So let's go out and catch people doing something right. And we've spent a lot of work in the last couple of years looking at people who work tired and identifying how they do things and the way that they do things in order to prevent fatigue-related errors. And these are what are called fatigue proofing and error analysis systems. I'll be happy to talk about those to people in detail later, but they're beyond the scope of a brief meeting today. And then lastly, you have what are called incident analysis systems. So the key idea in terms of working with these kind of systems is for the organisation to go and look at what are you doing at each level of this hazard control model. The typical tools that people will use at level 1, that is determining the sleep opportunity. There are software packages out that enable you to plug the rosters in and they will give you a quantitative measure of the degree of sleep opportunity that you've provided people. The most commonly used tools in this area in Australia are the FADE software, but there are also tools produced called FAST. There's one out of the UK called the HSE Index. Many regulators around the country are quite prepared to accept these as a de facto measure of whether you're providing people with an adequate sleep opportunity or not, and none of these software packages are particularly expensive. For most organisations, they're in the order of $300 to $500, or some are even free in the public domain. As I said before, in terms of determining whether people have obtained sufficient sleep, there are a number of tools around now that enable organisations to make the fundamental step, which is to say, if you turn up for work and you are fit for work, we will assume it means the following things. Drug and alcohol are below certain levels, sleep is above a certain level, and wake is below a certain level. And we see people developing sleep-wake contracts that enable organisations to determine the amount of sleep required to be fit for work. And again, we would be happy to take questions on the details of that. In terms of the behavioural symptoms, again, there are a number of public domain symptom checklists that you can use to assist supervisors in discussing levels of fatigue with people. One of the big problems in a lot of organisations is they will have something that kind of says something along the lines of, if the supervisor or the employee thinks that they are fatigued, they should put their hand up and we will take them out of the workplace or reassign them to tasks where they're at least risk. Going back to the question that was asked before, that's a very difficult conversation. I would ask you to think about the following issue. Getting your hand and putting your hand up to say, I'm tired, is a difficult conversation for a number of reasons in workplaces. On the other hand, I contrast that with a highly proceduralised language for an organisation which says, dear Mr. or Ms. Supervisor, I've had less than the prescribed amount of sleep and I'm therefore at risk for a fatigue-related error. How are we going to manage that risk today? And putting it into that very formal, structured language where somebody says, we have declared thresholds for the amount of sleep it needs to be in order to be fit for work is quite important. For those of you who are interested, as a rough rule of thumb, we think that people who have had less than 5 hours sleep in the 24 hours prior to starting work, or less than 12 in the prior 48, are at significant risk of a fatigue-related error. Now, we're not suggesting that's the amount of sleep that you need to live a happy and wholesome life. But what we're suggesting is that there is quite good scientific literature to show that once your sleep goes below those 5 in the prior 24 and 12 in the prior 48 thresholds, then the likelihood of a fatigue-related error is significantly increased and would require additional controls to be in place if that individual was to continue working. And again, how you implement that is going to depend on the maturity of the organisation, the controls that are available, but we have seen a large number of organisations in the last couple of years quite successful at introducing those level 2 and 3 controls. The idea behind that is you have a multi-layered system that will enable people to manage, identify and control the risks. So it's important that when people do raise it, and you have to do a lot of cultural re-engineering within the organisation in order to do that, and I'm going to explain to you how we have been helping organisations do that. I'm going to put a few caveats in here. How well you do that is going to depend a lot on the cultural capital that you have around safety within the organisation and the maturity of the organisation to manage fatigue as a hazard, both from the employee and the employer perspective. I'm going to give you some frameworks for how to manage that. So could we have the next slide, Sue? And I understand that this is a journey. Our experience has been that organisations typically take a couple of years to do that journey, and part of it is based around initially getting the training and education right. For those of you who are interested, there are now a number of training and education programs around fatigue management. There are actually specified curricula within the vocational sector in Australia, and under the Australian qualifications frameworks we have 2 key training and education programs under the Transport Infrastructure and Logistics framework. There is a Cert 2 course for employees who are at risk of being fatigued, and it effectively shows you how to optimise your use of your time away from work in order to return to work fit for work, and how to determine whether you are fit for work. The next level course is the Australian Qualifications Framework Cert 3 program, which is targeted towards supervisors, dispatchers, rostering clerks, the kind of people who make decisions about the working times of other people. And that program is delivered by a number of providers around Australia, all can be delivered by yourself. And the grad cert in fatigue risk management systems, which will be launched in June this year, which will be delivered by Central Queensland University. We have developed that course in response to a number of recent regulatory changes in which those people who are looking to develop advanced fatigue management, both in road, rail or in other areas, are required to have a fatigue management plan that is developed and signed off on by a suitably qualified individual. This graduate certificate will underpin the development of a suitable qualification for people who do that. Hopefully some of this has been useful, and some of this might trigger some discussions on how you might think about developing fatigue management policy within your organisation, whether you've identified at least the key legal and regulatory drivers around fatigue management, and some of the things that you could kind of do in terms of assuring whether the kind of risk assessment tools that you're currently using will match up to what is considered best practice at the moment.
I just wanted to thank you in taking part in the Lunch and Learn series. For the people who have questions, what shall we do going forward? Do you want to respond to them at a later time, or what would you like to do?
Yeah, look, just ask them to forward them to me at my email, which is drew.dawson@me.com. and I'll try and respond to them. What I'll do is I'll wait till tomorrow, and then if the questions end up with lots of people answering the same question, I'll just do the same answer to each of the clusters of questions.
Oh, that's perfect.
I would be more than happy to respond to those, and if that's useful, we're happy to help.
Oh, thank you. I think that will be appreciated because there's a fair few that we have left unanswered. So thank you everybody for your time today, and thank you Drew especially. Have a wonderful rest of your day and look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you. Bye.